and began serving as an ordained Unitarian Universalist minister in 1979. He's been retired from parish ministry for quite a few years, but he continues to serve our movement as a historian, a scholar, a leader, a teacher. And rather than hear me say Mark's words, I'm going to share an excerpt, a brief excerpt from this sermon so that you can see and hear him delivering these words. And I just want to note one thing here. In this short excerpt, he uses a masculine pronoun for God. But I want you to know that as a preacher, and even in other places in this sermon, he sometimes calls God she, sometimes he, and sometimes with no gender. I want you to know that he is someone who can hold that width, that breadth of God. So here is Reverend Dr. Mark Morrison Reed.
What a relief to feel that ultimately there is nothing I can do to alienate myself from God's loving embrace, the almighty but tender arms of the creative force that upholds and sustains life. Universalism's insight is that you cannot coerce people into loving one another. The commandments are not threats. If they are not fulfilled, God will not withdraw his love. No one will ever draw true love from another with punishment. God's love is given to all, freely given, as a more powerful force for good than fear will ever be. And love is not just stronger than fear, it is stronger than death. Love survives. Love abides in us, and thus all the departed reside in us. Behind this is the simple truth. What is it? In being loved, we learn to love. We all know that, right? In being loved, we learn to love. Those who feel that love and that feel God's infinite love within themselves will in turn feel so good about themselves, so connected to others and life, so full of compassion that they will not be able to help but to spread more love. It will overflow from them. And what is that love but to stand before life with an open heart, accepting arms, and eyes that are wide with wonder.
I want you to hold on to those words from Reverend Mark while I take us back for just a minute to the 1700s. So in 1741, a minister by the name of Jonathan Edwards preached and published a sermon in Massachusetts. Actually, he preached this sermon in multiple places. It's a sermon that came to have historic significance as an example of the theology of the first great awakening in this country, as evangelical revivals were sweeping through Britain and the 13 British colonies here. The sermon was entitled "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," and it contained some lovely gems like this. I'm going to quote from this sermon. "The God that holds you over the pit of hell, much in the same way as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire, abhors you and is dreadfully provoked. His wrath towards you burns like fire. He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire. He is of purer eyes than to bear to have you in his sight. You are 10,000 times more abominable in his eyes than the most hateful, venomous serpent is in ours. Nothing but his hand that holds you keeps you from falling into the fire every moment. So when we say fire and brimstone preaching or fire and brimstone theology, this sermon often gets held up as the prime example. I am sharing this with you this morning, friends, to simply remind us of the religious context into which John Murray, the founder of Universalism in the United States, arrived 250 years ago. The wisdom story we heard just a little while ago has become somewhat mythologized, but it is true that John Murray arrived on the shores of what is now New Jersey, having lost his wife and his child and having spent time in debtor's prison. It is true that he had been a Methodist minister, had known John Wesley himself, and had been turned somewhat heretical by the writings and preaching of some with Universalist theology in Britain. And it is true that he met Thomas Potter, who had built a chapel waiting for one who might preach about a loving God. And it is true that John Murray went on to found the first Universalist congregation in the colonies up in Gloucester, Massachusetts. Now, the theology of Universalism was not entirely new. Since the beginnings of Christianity, there has always been a thread of thought that God would save all, that all souls would be returned to heaven. But Universalism in Murray's time was considered heretical. It questioned the existence of hell at all and wondered how could a good and loving God damn souls to hell for all eternity. This is our theological legacy. As Unitarian Universalists, we have inherited and expanded on this idea of the wide embrace of God. Here, I want to pause for a moment, and I want to ask you a question. What do you think we are doing when we gather at 10 o'clock on Sunday morning? We call it worship, right? And how many of us have wondered from time to time, well, what exactly are we worshiping? We all certainly don't use the word God. Not all of us, most of us would not consider ourselves theists. We certainly are not bowing down before some idea of a supreme being. Definitely not the old white guy with the beard hanging out up in the sky. Certainly not the one who judges the sinners and the saints and divides up the saved and the damned. And yet we are here for more than a nice talk and intellectual stimulation on a Sunday morning. I mean, you could get that by watching a TED Talk or go listen to On Being here in a little while on NPR. To get at the answer to this question, perhaps, I want you to turn inward for a moment and to think about a time that you had a felt sense of wholeness, of acceptance, of belonging. Perhaps a time when you relied on your own inner sense of worthiness despite what all others had to say about you. your basic worthiness as a human being, or perhaps a time when you stood in awe before the mystery of life, this universe. And in that moment, everything else, including your ego, dropped away, and you were just receiving the gift of being here at all. Or maybe what comes to mind for you is a time when you encountered a deep love with another person, an unconditional love that was offered to you outside of any question about whether you deserved it or not. That love, that gift of simply being, that place of resting, that's what I mean when sometimes I begin a prayer with Spirit of life, God of love, great mystery. When we gather, we are here to practice connecting with and experiencing and expanding that. To, as Mark Morrison Reed puts it, stand before life with an open heart, accepting arms, and eyes that are wide with wonder. Unitarian Ralph Waldo Emerson famously wrote, "That which dominates our imaginations and our thoughts will determine our lives and character. Therefore, it behooves us to be careful what we worship. For what we are worshiping, we are becoming." So can you imagine, way back in 1770, what imagination it took for John Murray and his wife, Judith Sargent Murray, and for Thomas Potter, and for all those others who rejected an idea of hell and damnation. What imagination it took for them to proclaim a different way, to say our lives will not be dominated by fear of punishment. Our lives are not actually made better by worshiping a God who abhors us. What does it serve us to think of eternal damnation after this life when there's enough man-made hell on earth? Imagine there is no hell below us. And it should be no surprise. It's actually illogical what developed next. By unbinding themselves from spiritual fear and proclaiming universal salvation for all, pretty soon who they meant by all started expanding. There were real life ethical implications for believing in the inherent worth and dignity of every person, which is how we say it today. For believing that God wants abundant life for all people. The founder of the first anti-slavery society in the United States, Benjamin Rush, was a Universalist. The Red Cross was founded by Clara Barton, a Universalist. The first woman officially ordained by a denominational body in the United States was Olympia Brown, ordained as a Universalist and also a fierce suffragist. And eventually this originally Christian-rooted Universalism expanded to include and affirm many pathways to the truth. A global universalism means a global solidarity to uphold the worth and rights of all people, regardless of their faith. Universalism's call is for love, not fear, to enliven us, to fire us, to connect us to one another, and to pull us on into the most powerful and true version of ourselves we can be. And Universalism's call requires us to ever expand who we include in that love. As Reverend Nancy MacDonald Ladd states it, Universalism is the unyielding belief that each and every person is endowed with an original blessing that calls them and claims them regardless of circumstances or even of worthiness. Every single person inherently endowed with worth and dignity, she says. Original blessing for every single person with no categorical exclusions in the least. Are you the right kind of woman, the right kind of immigrant, the right kind of American, the right kind of young Black man? Because if you are not, our culture is ready to wash its hands of you. And that is an unstated but deeply lived doctrine of hell on earth. She says it runs contrary to every thread of the universalism at our core, a tradition that calls us to universally, uncategorically love the hell out of this world. This is not an easy faith to live out, my friends. You know, sometimes we get criticized for being a little too optimistic about humanity. And yet I think this is not a simple or easy faith to live out. Salvation comes not through personal profession of belief, but through an acceptance of being loved and putting that love back out into the world. I don't know about you, but I often get hung up on that first step. Can I imagine, let alone really accept, that I am wholly and fully loved just as I am? Whew, for some of us, that is really hard. And our culture makes it even harder. We are told, many of us, over and over and over, that our value is determined by our work, or by the color of our skin, or by how skinny we are, or by how physically able we are, or by how much money we have. But those glimpses of transcendent experience that I asked you to think about earlier, they give me a momentary experience of something else besides my worth being determined by all those external factors. They give me an experience that tells me that my life, just as it is sacred and is connected to all other life. Spiritual practice for us, worship for us, is a commitment to open ourselves up over and over and over again to that experience. We commit to open ourselves to that experience. It may not always happen, but we show up and open ourselves to cultivate that feeling of resting in love, that feeling of the sacredness of life. There is a love holding you. There is a love holding me. There is a love holding all that we love, and we can rest in that love. We rest in that love so that we ourselves can in turn be carriers of that love, so that we can recommit over and over again to being a place of life-saving welcome. This is real, y'all. Life-saving welcome for all people, no exceptions. Just this week in downtown Louisville, Kentucky, the Unitarian Universalist Church there has been providing safety and sanctuary to the people mourning and protesting the killing of Breonna Taylor. Real sanctuary. Calling for the police officers who murdered her to be held accountable. And calling for a radical rethinking of what public safety means. Welcoming and providing sanctuary, telling the truth in love. This is our universalism in action. And friends, let me just say that calling for systems of policing or many other social systems in our country to be held account for the harm they have done to African American people, and calling for transforming those systems to protect all lives, that is universalism in action too. Because we believe that even those of us complicit in systems that uphold racist policies and oppress our Black siblings, our immigrant, our Asian, our disabled, our LGBTQ siblings, we believe all of us complicit in those systems can be saved from that evil. I'm going to call it evil today, my friends. Even me, even you. Universalist Hosea Ballou wrote, "There is one inevitable criterion of judgment concerning religious faith. Can you reduce it to practice? If not, have none of it." We are in a time of great suffering, and at the same time, the possibility of great transformations. Actually, we're going to be transformed no matter what. I think the question is, how will we be transformed? Which way will we be transformed? Will we live out of fear and judgment, or are we going to live out of love? As we speak out about racism, about incredible abuses of power at the highest levels in our government, about our endangered democracy, about impending fascism, let us do it out of a fierce love that tells the truth and lets no one off the hook, and also does not stoop to dehumanizing anyone. Because universalism's final challenge to us is one that I don't know I will ever reach in my lifetime, but I'm going to keep trying. I invite you to keep trying with me. Universalism's final challenge to us is that everyone, even the person who did great harm to us personally, even the officer who shot Breonna Taylor, even Donald Trump, they too are held in a love that will not let them go. We are asked to try to imagine that. We are not responsible for personally Williams. May she rest in peace and in power. Imagine what we could create if we were not always in the struggle. Imagine what we could envision if we could just be let go, to just go there. We rise to be our true selves in relationship to our families and communities, recognizing our liberating and whole selves, honoring them and others as we strive for abundant communities, abundant lives, abundant relationships, and abundant values and cultural manifestations, the embodiment of radical love, care, and sanctuary. Elandria says, it's time, embodiment time, living our values out loud. Let me every day live my values out loud. Let us every day live our love. May it be so, and amen.